on what the value of I is. Okay, very good. I think you're already getting the idea. I is not the variable getting 0. I is only controlling which container in the array A is getting initialized to 0. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the trace, because the way I set up the trace columns is already slightly different from before. So we'll go ahead and open a new window. Now the way I represent a trace is it is very consistent with how memory is used in a computer. In other words, when you look at a trace, the picture that you get in a trace kind of represents how memory will be organized when you're running this program inside a computer. So keep that in mind. Okay, we have our usual, so let's start with comments. We have our usual line number. We have our usual variable I in this case. But then we have A. Now, A being an array can consume or use up one or more columns. Each individual item of an array has its own column. So let's just say that in this case, I want A to be an array of 3 elements. If A is an array of 3 elements, then A bracket 0 has its own column. A bracket 1 has its own column, and A bracket 2 has its own column. Most of the time, I would combine these 3 cells just to indicate that A is an array of 3 elements. So visually, you can actually see that array A has 3 columns. That step is not required. When you're doing the second exam, you don't have to merge the cells to indicate a particular array has X many elements. So are we doing okay so far? Okay. Let's go ahead and just resize the columns a little bit. Go ahead.
How do you know where to stop with the array, 0, 1, 2?
I have to tell you ahead of time. This is something that has to be given. Okay. Are there any other questions about how the columns are set up? The most important point is each element in the array has its own column, which tells you that each element in an array can be used just like any other variables. Okay, it has its own column. It can be updated. You can also retrieve its own value independent of the other elements of the same array. Let's go ahead and trace the algorithm, but we'll start with specifying the pre-value or precondition values of each variable. Do I need to give I a particular initial value?
No.
Will it be useful to give it an initial value? No.
We're going to change it to 0.
Exactly. We're going to change it. We're going to override it anyway, so we might as well say, well, we don't need to know its initial value. How about the values of the array? No. We don't actually need it. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and use question marks in this case, and and it will be obvious why question marks will be fine. That's my precondition, and now we are ready to execute line 1. The effect of line 1 is easy. I goes from question mark to a 0. Now we have to evaluate the condition of line 2, which is I is less than bar A bar. Is that true or is that false based on the array that we are dealing with right now? It is true because what is the value of I? I is 0. What should be bar A bar?
3.
Bar A bar is 3. 0 is less than 3 is true. Okay. So that means we are going to move on to line 3. Now line 3 is the important part, so I'm going to highlight it a little bit just so that you guys remember this line is special. This is something that I want to explain with this particular trace. When you look at A bracket I gets 0, the question is, what exactly is getting 0? We know it is an assignment statement. Something is going to be changed to 0. The question is, what is getting changed to 0? In this case, I is not a variable to be changed. Okay? Because A bracket I, just like this A bracket 2, is saying I want to specify container 2 of box A in this example on the whiteboard. In the code here, it is almost the same thing, except I'm accessing something in box A. That's why the A is outside of the square brackets. The integer inside the square bracket specifies which item within the box I want to access. Except in this case, it is not a constant anymore. It is just an expression that so happens to have an integer value. The expression is I. I is an integer. What is the value of I at this point?
0.
I is 0 at this point. So A bracket I is specifying A bracket 0 in this case.
That gets 0.
And A bracket 0 is the one variable that is getting 0. And that's why we are updating column D to become 0. Are there any questions at this point? Because this is the most important part about using an array, is whatever you specify inside the square brackets is only going to control which element inside the array you're trying to access. Yep.
So for line 1, we had set I to 1, for instance.
Mhm.
Then
it will start with column E. Column E being
Okay.
A bracket 1 here.
okay.
Yeah. So sometimes I switch to the column designation because that way I can specify exactly which column in the spreadsheet I'm talking about. Yep, go ahead.
So basically, A square bar I square bar means we want to assign variable I as the index for the array.
I is being used to specify, or the value of I at the time that I execute the statement is used to specify which item within the array I want to access. Because remember, the containers inside an array, they all have numbers. And I is a number, or the expression inside the square bracket is a number. So that number basically specifies, okay, which item in the array do you want to access? Yep, go ahead.
So does mean for the line 1, the I is, you just specify for the element in array, right?
Line 1 is not special in any way. It's no more special than a normal.
I mean, the line 1 I is that.
You
0?
mean this column?
Or that one?
You mean this row?
The line 3 is come from the line 1, from the sheet 1, right?
This I is currently 0 because of line 1. Because that's how we initialized I. But I will change. Okay? I does not stay 0 all the time. It will get bumped up in the next line. The next line will bump it up. Okay. Any other questions at this point? No questions? Okay. After line 3, we go to line 4. This is, this loop has 2 lines inside the loop body. Line 4 should not be mysterious. It's just incrementing I, something that we have seen a lot. And then we go back to line 2 because this is a loop. When we are done with the body of the loop, we go back to the first line to reevaluate the condition. Is I still less than bar A bar?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, it is true because I is now 1, but bar A bar is 3. 1 is less than 3 is true. Then we move on to line 3 again. So once again, this line is important because this time what are we doing?
We're giving A bracket 1 the 0 value.
Exactly. Because I has a value of 1. Okay? Because I has a value of 1, then A bracket I is accessing A bracket 1. A bracket 1 is using column E. So in this case, column E is the one that is updated to a 0. So we put a 0 here. Are we okay so far? Are you guys starting to appreciate, the power of array indexing? because we are using line 3. I mean, you know, if you look at the trace, go ahead.
If we updated, okay, we went to line 3 and we updated a bracket 1 to 0. It doesn't change I from being 1, right? It
I
doesn't
is,
go-
I is 1 before we get to line 3.
So it stays.
Yeah, we are not changing the value of I. We are using the value of I to determine which item in the array we are accessing.
Can I write in comments like a bracket I equals a bracket 1 just to keep it straight?
Sure.
Or would that be incorrect?
No, that would be a correct interpretation. So a bracket I is, okay, uses the value of I at this point to specify which item in array A to get the value 0. How's that?
Thank you.
Okay, sure. So after line 3, we go to line 4. Line 4 is the boring one. You know, goes from 1 to 2 in this case. We're incrementing the value of I. Then we go back to line 2. Line 2 is asking the same question again. I is less than bar A bar is true because 2 is less than 3. Then we go to line 3 again, and this time A bracket I is accessing A bracket 2 because I at this point has a value of 2. Okay? But the important part is to remember we are not limited to only use a single variable I or single variable j. We can use I times I minus j, the whole thing to the power of 3 minus 600, and so on and so forth. As long as that integer value is going from 0 to bar A bar minus 1, we are fine. Okay? So that really makes it a very powerful technique because now, using the same line, you can access a different portion of the array depending on the value of the expression inside the square brackets. Okay. So we'll go ahead and execute this line 3 one last time and specify a different color. But this time, I think everybody agrees that column F should be updated because I has a value of 2. So A bracket I is actually referring to A bracket 2, and A bracket 2 has its own column, column F, and that's getting updated to 0. We go to line 4, boring stuff. It goes from 2 to 3. Go back to line 2. I is now 3. 3 is less than 3 is false. So we get out of the loop, and we get to the post. Do we have any questions about this trace? Yep.
This isn't very useful, is it? I mean,
Oh, it is very useful.
you're just making everything 0, right?
Oh, you mean the algorithm itself?
Yeah.
It is useful because otherwise you will have to say, okay, that's a very good question. Okay, the question or the comment was, this does not seem to be very useful because I am using 5 lines to initialize an array that only has 3 elements. Okay, but what if you have an array of 20,000 elements and you want every single item in the array to start with a value of 0? Then you have 2 alternatives. You can either use the loop, the one that we have here. It does not change the size of the code itself. It will change the amount of time it takes to initialize the entire array because now we have 20,000 elements instead of 3. But if you don't use a loop, then we'll have to spell it out, like A bracket 0 gets 0, A bracket 1 gets 0, A bracket 2 gets 0, all the way up to A bracket 19,999 gets 0. Are you seeing the usefulness of this code here? Okay, go ahead.
Also, the usefulness of this is if your array could vary. If you want to apply this way he wrote it here,